With the Paris 2024 Olympics recently wrapping up, you might have found yourself thinking beyond the medals and the athletes.
Yeah.
Maybe you've wondered about what hosting an event of that size really does for a city and a country once the closing ceremony is over.
That's precisely what we're diving into today. We're going to look at the money side of hosting the Olympic Games.
Okay?
We'll be talking about what people expected for Paris 2024 financially, what actually happened, maybe.
And what we can learn from past Olympics too, right? About the financial impact.
Exactly. It's a really complex picture.
Okay, let's unpack this because when Paris was trying to get the games, there were some really big, exciting numbers being talked about.
Oh, definitely. Huge projections early on.
I remember hearing about a study done way back in 2016, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That looked at the potential economic benefits.
That's the one. That early study for France estimated that the Olympics could bring in as much as 10.7 billion.
Wow, 10.7 billion and jobs too.
And create up to 247,000 jobs. A big chunk of that, somewhere between 1.4 and 3.5 billion, was expected just from tourism.
Just tourism alone.
Yeah. But, it's important to be a bit critical of those initial figures.
How come?
Well, often studies like these are commissioned by the people bidding for the games, so they have a reason to paint a very positive picture.
Right, makes sense. They want to sell the idea.
Exactly. And history shows us these numbers often don't quite pan out exactly as predicted.
Right, so take those numbers with a grain of salt. Because I also saw a more recent analysis that sounded, well, a bit more cautious.
Definitely more cautious.
What changed between 2016 and now? I mean, obviously things happened,
A
but
lot can happen in that time, for sure. The big things that shifted the economic landscape were, well, the pandemic, obviously, and the significant inflation we've seen around the world. These events naturally made those initial predictions less reliable.
and we're seeing some of that caution reflected in what happened with Paris, aren't we?
It seems so.
It was surprising to hear that in the month just before the Games, the total number of hotel rooms booked in Paris was actually slightly lower than the year before.
Yeah, that raised some eyebrows.
Even some major airlines reported that bookings from regular travelers, not people going to the Olympics specifically, were a bit disappointing. That doesn't seem to make sense. Shouldn't it be packed?
It does seem odd at first glance, but there are a few likely reasons.
Right.
When a city is hosting a massive event like the Olympics, there are a lot of closures and disruptions, roads closed, certain areas restricted.
Right, security and logistics.
Exactly. This can actually discourage regular tourists who aren't interested in the games.
Ah, okay. They just want a normal Paris trip.
Precisely. Also, local businesses that depend on everyday foot traffic might struggle during this period. Think about, local cafes or shops.
Yeah, if their usual customers can't get there easily.
And while increasing taxes on tourists during the Olympics can bring in some extra money, it can also make the city less appealing to travelers who are watching their budgets.
So they might spend less on other things, like souvenirs or restaurants.
Potentially, yeah. The general hassle and higher costs associated with a major event can simply make some people decide to go somewhere else entirely.
So maybe a short-term dip, just during the main event.
That's the thinking.
But the expectation is that tourism will recover later.
Yeah.
Maybe people delayed their trips.
Exactly. Some analysts think that this slight drop in early summer might just be temporary. It's possible that some people put off their trips to avoid the Olympic crowds and higher prices.
Okay.
The hope is that France and Paris will still be popular destinations, and people who couldn't make it during the Olympics might choose to visit later.
Did we see any sign of that?
Well, we did see that hotel bookings were still higher than usual into mid-September.
Oh, interesting. So around the Paralympics.
Yeah, suggesting continued interest around that time, so maybe a shift rather than a total loss.
This makes me wonder about something bigger, though. We see these huge amounts of money spent on building things for the Olympics. Stadiums, villages.
Massive investments, yeah.
But it often feels like the immediate financial benefits are unclear, or at least not as amazing as initially promised.
That's often the case.
So why do countries keep investing so much? I even saw people online debating this,
Oh, yeah. What were they saying?
Like whether hosting usually leads to financial losses, thinking about Rio or Sochi.
Right, those are often cited.
Or if there are real success stories like London or maybe Beijing or even LA back in '84.
That's the big question everyone asks. What's interesting is how the approach to hosting has changed over time.
How so?
There's been a clear move towards using existing venues more, trying not to build everything from scratch.
Okay. More sustainable, maybe.
And cheaper, definitely. Los Angeles really led the way with this back in 1984.
Right. I've heard the 84 games mentioned as profitable.
They are often pointed to as one of the most profitable ever. By not building lots of new, specialized stadiums, they kept costs way down.
And focused on sponsorships.
Exactly, and made the most of sponsorships. Now, many recent hosts, including Tokyo, Paris, and LA again in the future.
They're hosting again soon, 2028.
Right, they're focusing on upgrading existing places to minimize the need for entirely new construction, reusing and revitalizing.
That makes sense from a money-saving perspective, and probably for the environment too, right? Less new building.
Absolutely, both counts.
Although, someone online mentioned that Tokyo had a really tough break with the pandemic hitting right before their games.
Oh, absolutely brutal timing for them.
Which meant basically no tourists coming in.
None. And even some sponsors pulling out, which really hurt their bottom line. A unique and unfortunate situation. But sometimes the Olympics can push forward improvements to a city that might have happened eventually anyway.
But they get fast-tracked.
Exactly. They get done faster because of the deadline. For example, someone online mentioned new train lines and better roads being built in Paris.
Okay, infrastructure upgrades.
And Los Angeles also has its 28 by 28 plan,
What's that?
aiming to finish 28 public transportation projects by the time they host in 2028, using the games as a catalyst.
Huh, that's clever.
And it's worth remembering Atlanta in 1996, they reportedly made a profit.
Really, a profit.
That's the report. And they also got significant upgrades to their infrastructure, plus it boosted the city's image.
So there are examples of things going well. It's not all doom and gloom financially.
Not always, no.
But then you often hear about how much over budget most Olympics end up being.
Ah, yes, the cost overruns. That's a really important point. Studies have consistently shown that most Olympics since 1960 have gone significantly over their planned budgets.
Significantly. Like how much?
The average overrun is actually quite high, around 172%.
172%. Wow. Yeah. Rio and Tokyo are recent good examples of games that cost way, way more than expected.
So the initial budget is almost fiction.
It often seems that way in retrospect. Again, the 1984 Los Angeles games are often held up as an exception.
Because they reused so much infrastructure.
Exactly. Reused what they already had, kept the new builds to a minimum.
It feels like there might be a disconnect sometimes between the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, the people who run the Olympics, and the cities that actually host them when it comes to money.
How do you mean?
Well, I know the IOC makes a lot of money from things like TV rights and big corporate sponsorships. Billions, right?
Oh, absolutely. Broadcasting and sponsorships are huge revenue streams for the IOC.
But who ends up paying most of the actual bills for the venues, the security, the operations?
Well, the common argument, and it's a strong one, is that the city and the country hosting the Olympics end up paying for most of it. The infrastructure, the security, the logistics.
That seems like the bulk of the cost. It usually is. We saw with Rio, for example, that the city ended up with a lot of debt after the games.
So the IOC gets the revenue, the city gets the bill. Is that fair?
Well, from the IOC's viewpoint, their income funds the Olympic movement globally, supports athletes, national Olympic committees. It's somewhat separate from what the host spends directly on staging the games.
Okay.
However, someone online brought up an interesting counterpoint.
Which was?
That sometimes, even if the government, the public sector, loses money on the games,
Yeah.
private businesses, the private sector, can still make a profit. Construction companies, hotels, service providers.
Ah, okay. So public funds enable private profit.
Some might see this as a legitimate role for the government, creating economic opportunity. Even if the direct public financial return isn't always obvious or positive, it's a debated point.
This brings up the idea of legacy, right? That whole argument.
Definitely.
The argument that even if the games don't make a direct profit on paper, the long-term benefits are worth it.
That's the hope, the new infrastructure, the overall impact on the city.
But we've also seen cases, like you mentioned, Rio, where some of the venues end up not being used much afterwards, just sitting there.
That's the risk, the white elephant problem. The idea of legacy is absolutely key in justifying the costs.
So the hope is what? New transport stays useful.
Exactly. The hope is that the new transportation systems, stadiums, and housing built for the Olympics will continue to benefit the local people for many years.
Okay.
There's also what economists call a multiplier effect.
Right. Heard of that. The money ripples through the economy.
Kind of. The initial money spent on the games doesn't just disappear, it circulates, gets spent again, creating more economic activity in other areas, hopefully.
And there's the non-money stuff, too.
Absolutely. We shouldn't forget that successfully hosting the Olympics can raise a country's profile on the global stage. Prestige, potentially leading to new political or trade opportunities. And a truly successful legacy isn't just about physical buildings. It also includes things like maybe more people getting involved in sports,
Healthier population.
better community facilities, and a lasting positive image of the city. We need to look at more than just whether a stadium is still standing years later.
And the prestige of it all. Cities want to be seen as world-class, right?
Oh, for sure.
Hoping to attract more tourists and businesses in the future just by having that Olympic City tag.
That's definitely part of the motivation for bidding.
But is that prestige a sure thing when it comes to bringing in more money? Someone online questioned that.
Question the link.
Yeah, like, does just being a former Olympic city actually make a place more prestigious in a way that directly leads to more economic benefits compared to cities that haven't hosted?
That's a valid question to ask. It's hard to measure definitively.
Right.
While wanting global recognition is definitely a reason why cities bid, it's not always clear how directly that translates into more tourists or investments in the long run. A city's appeal depends on many things.
True. Not just the Olympics from years ago.
Exactly. Location, culture, other attractions, economic climate, lots of factors.
So, if the way things have been done in the past has so many potential problems, cost overruns, questionable legacy, what are some ideas for how the Olympics could be hosted differently in the future?
We're seeing a few interesting proposals being discussed more seriously now.
Like what?
One idea is to have a set of permanent host cities. Or maybe rotate the games between a small number of locations that already have most of the needed facilities.
So no massive new build every 4 years.
Exactly. That would definitely cut down on the need to build huge amounts of new infrastructure repeatedly.
Makes sense.
It's also worth remembering that many countries, especially developing ones, see bidding for the Olympics as a way to showcase their progress to the world.
Right, a sort of arrival on the world stage.
Kind of. And this often does lead to significant investments in infrastructure, airports, roads, transit, even if the games themselves don't make a direct profit.
Like maybe Sochi or Rio or Beijing, they spent huge amounts.
They did. Think about those games in that context, too, despite their massive costs. Sochi, for instance, reportedly had cost overruns exceeding 300%.
300%, good grief.
Made them one of the most expensive and over-budget games in history.
So are things changing? Is the IOC doing anything?
Well, the IOC, the people who run the Olympics, they have been trying to make the bidding process cheaper and more flexible.
Wow.
Encouraging more use of existing venues, allowing bids from regions or even multiple cities hosting together.
Co-hosting. That's new.
Relatively, yeah. However, they still face the challenge of getting enough cities interested in bidding.
Really? You'd think it'd be super competitive.
It used to be more so. But we saw with Brisbane getting the 2032 Summer Games, they were basically the only city seriously in the running at the end, unopposed.
Huh. Maybe cities are getting wary of the costs and risks.
That seems likely. And we can't ignore unexpected events like how the pandemic really, really hurt the finances and tourism revenue of the Tokyo Games. Just bad luck, but a huge impact.
Which brings us back to Paris 2024. There was a lot of talk about it being a new era for the Olympics. What exactly did that mean?
Yes, the head of the IOC, Thomas Bach, called Paris 2024 the Olympic Games of a new era.
Okay.
This was based on some recent changes in how the Olympics are run under something called Olympic Agenda 2020 reforms.
What were the goals?
The focus was on making the games more appealing to young people, more centered in urban areas, more inclusive,
Inclusive how?
more sustainable, more environmentally friendly, and significantly, it was the first Olympics with full gender parity and equal number of male and female athletes competing.
Ah, that's a big step.
It was. The games also intentionally spread out beyond just Paris.
Oh, yeah. Where else?
Events like sailing were held down in Marseille, and famously, the surfing competition took place all the way over in Tahiti, French Polynesia.
Wow, Tahiti. That's far.
Very far. But it spread the games out, and they reached a huge global audience. Apparently, most of the world's population tuned in at some point.
I remember hearing about some of the new things for Paris, too. Like, wasn't there a park for fans?
Yes! The Champions Park. where fans could get closer to the medal winners, and they had the Marathon Pour Two.
The marathon for everyone.
Yeah, a marathon open to the public running on the same course as the Olympic athletes, which was pretty cool.
That is cool. And didn't they sell a record number of tickets?
Yeah.
Seems like people were definitely interested.
They did. Paris 2024 sold over 9.5 million tickets.
9.5 million.
Which is more than any previous Olympics, showing that there was a lot of interest from fans, despite maybe some of the pre-games tourism dips we talked about.
Right.
They also used a new central system for selling tickets and hospitality packages for these games, trying to streamline it.
Okay. One thing that often goes unnoticed, maybe, but must be really important, is protecting the official Olympic brand. The rings, the logos.
Absolutely. That's a huge part of it. As part of the agreement to host the Games, Paris 2024 and the French government had a big responsibility to protect all the official Olympic symbols and logos.
How do they do that?
Well, the people in charge of the Olympics and Paris 2024 had a global program to monitor the internet for unauthorized use.
Like counterfeit merchandise.
Exactly. And also protect the rights of the TV broadcasters, who pay billions for those exclusive rights. It's about maintaining the value of the brand.
Makes sense.
Sure.
Finally, a big question for any city that hosts the Olympics is what happens to all the stadiums and venues afterwards? Do they just sit empty, become ruins?
That's a major concern. And honestly, what happens to Olympic venues after the Games is a really mixed bag historically.
So sometimes good, sometimes bad.
Pretty much. There's been research done on this, looking at venue usage long term. They classify venues as like newly built permanent ones, existing ones that were reused, or temporary structures.
Okay, and the temporary ones are just taken down.
Right, so it makes sense to focus on the permanent venues when we talk about long-term use and legacy.
So what does the research show about those permanent venues?
The good news is that the research shows that a significant majority of the permanent Olympic venues do continue to be used after the Games are over.
Oh, that's better than I might have expected. Not all white elephants, then.
Not all, no. There's quite a high rate of continued use, apparently.
That's good to hear. What kinds of things are they used for?
A really wide variety of things, actually. Many continue to be used for sports, as you'd expect.
Like training facilities or other competitions?
Exactly, for training athletes, hosting other national or international competitions, or just for the public to use for recreation, like swimming pools or tracks.
Okay.
Others become event spaces for concerts or conferences. Some become tourist attractions in their own right.
Any other uses?
Yeah, some get turned into offices, cultural centers, museums, or even schools or university facilities.
Can you give some examples? Successful ones?
Sure, we have some great examples of venues that have been successfully reused. Think way back to the Panathinaikos Stadium in Athens.
The one from the first modern games.
Yeah, originally built way back in 329 BC, restored for 1896, it still hosts sporting and cultural events today.
Amazing.
Or Francis Field in St. Louis, the main stadium for the 1904 Games. It's still used by Washington University there.
Okay, older examples. More recently.
More recently, the main stadium from the London 2012 Olympics is now the home ground for West Ham United, a Premier League soccer team.
Right, I knew that.
And it hosts concerts and other sports too. And the Olympic Village from the Sydney 2000 Games was turned into a thriving residential neighborhood, Newington.
So it can be done well. Planning for afterwards is key.
Absolutely crucial. But we also know that sometimes things don't go so well, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
The research also found that some permanent venues end up not being used, just left derelict.
Sometimes. In some cases, maybe they were never even built as planned, or they were torn down later for various reasons. Maybe safety, maybe redevelopment.
Or just closed.
Or they simply closed or were abandoned, often because there wasn't a good plan, a sustainable business model for how to keep them running financially after the Olympics left town. Or they just reached the end of their natural lifespan.
So when you put it all together, it sounds like hosting the Olympics is this incredibly complicated situation, just so many factors.
It really is.
You have the initial hopes and those big splashy predictions.
Often very optimistic.
Then the often tough financial realities kick in, the risk of spending way, way too much.
That 172% average overrun number sticks in my mind.
Yeah, and then the really important part, maybe the most important, is planning for the future, the legacy, and how those expensive venues will actually be used.
Long-term vision is critical.
And even with all that planning, there's still no guarantee of success, is there?
Exactly. It's a big gamble. A high-stakes endeavor with the potential for significant rewards, tangible and intangible, but also considerable risks.
And figuring out the real financial impact, the true bottom line.
It's something that's often debated for years, even decades after the Games, and very hard to measure accurately and definitively. So many variables.
So as we think about future Olympic Games, Milan Cortina coming up, then LA, it makes you wonder, considering everything we've talked about, from the initial bids to what happens years later,
Yeah.
what do you think makes a truly successful Olympic Games for a city and its people? Is it just about making money, breaking even, or turning a profit?
Or is there more to it?
Or are there other things, community building, national pride, infrastructure improvements, promoting sport, that are just as or even more important?
That's the real question, isn't it? What's the ultimate measure of success?
Something to think about as we look ahead to the next Olympics.